Welcome to the historic Blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe, not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. Now beginning. Story 1. The Monk's Mug Monastic Brewing and Daily Hydration. In the silent, stone-walled cloisters of medieval Europe, where bells marked the passing hours and the rule of St. Benedict dictated monastic life, a curious paradox unfolded. These were communities devoted to asceticism, prayer, and service to God. And yet they brewed beer, gallons upon gallons of it, daily. But this wasn't beer as we know it today. This was Cerevisia, a lightly fermented, low-alcohol beverage often called small beer. And it wasn't brewed for pleasure. It was a lifeline. You may have heard that medieval water was unsafe. This is only partly true and somewhat misleading. Water sources varied greatly in quality depending on location, season, and proximity to livestock or human waste. While some rural springs remained clean, urban and monastic centers frequently relied on wells, streams, or river access, often shared with animals or used for washing latrines downstream. Illnesses like dysentery, typhoid, and cholera found easy homes in such environments. Brewing was a quiet innovation of survival. Monastery centers of learning, manuscript copying, and agricultural management quickly became centers of brewing as well. As early as the 8th and 9th centuries, monks in what is now modern France, Germany, and Belgium were crafting low-strength beer not to indulge, but to nourish. The monastic rule of St. Benedict, foundational to Western monasticism, urged moderation in all things. Chapter 40 of the rule, for example, concedes that, although we read that wine is not at all proper for monks, yet because monks of our time cannot be persuaded of this, let us agree to drink it sparingly. This tells us two things. Monks were drinking alcohol, and their own spiritual leaders were trying unsuccessfully to discourage it. Wine was more prevalent in the Mediterranean regions, but farther north, ale became the daily choice. And sparingly is a relative term when your daily ration was a gallon. This wasn't drunkenness. Low-alcohol brews, typically between 0.5% and 2% ABV, served more like grain-based broth than intoxicants. They provided calories, hydration, and safety from contaminated water. Beer in this form was food. Brewing as ritual and routine. The monastery was a place of routine. Days were broken into canonical hours: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline, with specific prayers and work periods. Brewing fit naturally into this rhythm. Large monastic breweries maintained precise records, detailing grain quantities, fermentation times, and ale strength. These notes, often preserved in Latin, reflect not just a functional process but a near-scientific approach. Monks became brewing specialists, refining techniques, selecting yeasts often unknowingly, and improving shelf stability. These were not crude, slapdash operations. They were methodical, carefully tended systems of food production. At the monastery of St. Gall, Switzerland, a 9th century architectural plan includes 3 separate breweries, one for the monks, one for pilgrims, and one for the poor. Each produced beer of differing strengths and quality. The monks drank the best. The pilgrims received nourishing, moderate beer. The poor, still in need of sustenance, received the weakest. Even hierarchy existed in hydration. But again, we must resist the temptation to view this through a modern lens. No one was staggering about drunk. Instead, you might imagine a monk with his cowl drawn back, ladling out a thin, lukewarm beer into a wooden cup, sipping slowly after morning prayers before tending the herb garden. From sacred space to agricultural estate, monasteries owned land, a lot of land. They became agricultural powerhouses, and this included growing barley, wheat, and hops, though the latter came later, in widespread use after the 12th century. Early beers were often flavored with gruit, a mixture of herbs like bog myrtle, yarrow, and rosemary, before the standardization of hops became widespread. These flavoring agents also acted as preservatives and mild medicinal additives. Because the monks needed self-sufficiency, they managed every aspect of production. Water had to be sourced, grain ground and malted, and fermentation maintained, often in wooden casks. The brewery itself was an essential building in monastic compounds, often near the kitchens but separated enough to allow for airflow and fermentation temperature control. We might think of these brews as rustic, but in some regions, monastic beer came to represent the gold standard of production. By the High Middle Ages, certain abbeys, especially in what is now Belgium and Germany, were known far and wide for their beer. What started as a survival tool had become both a devotional duty and a reputation builder. And it was safe, safer at least than the stream that ran beside the cattle pasture. Ale for body and soul. Medieval medicine, guided by Galenic theory, taught that the body was composed of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Beer, especially when made with herbs or served warm, was believed to balance these humors. Monks often prescribed their brews to the ill, the elderly, and the infirm. Small beer offered not just calories but also a sense of wellness. For those fasting, which monks often did, sometimes consuming nothing solid from sunrise to sunset, beer was a loophole. Liquid bread, they called it. A monk could, technically, fast while still taking in several pints of nutritional beer per day. Records from Benedictine, Cistercian, and Trappist monasteries show beer rations ranging from 2 to 5 liters per day per person, depending on the season and fasting calendar. These were not indulgent quantities, they were baseline sustenance, especially in times when food was scarce or stomachs fragile. To survive, the monks needed beer, but it wasn't just a necessity, it became a ritual. Brewing was a form of labor that mirrored the divine order. Chaotic grain turned into life-giving sustenance through careful human stewardship. In this way, the monks saw themselves not as drunks, but as shepherds of fermentation. Brewing as charity. It would be easy to imagine monastic beer as cloistered away, reserved for those with shaved heads and woolen robes. But monasteries were more than spiritual centers. They were also hospitals, hostels, and soup kitchens. Monastic gates opened to travelers, pilgrims, beggars, and refugees, and each of these visitors needed food and drink. The ale provided to these outsiders was often weaker, but no less important. Monasteries could not afford to poison the poor. Even the most modest beer offered hydration and caloric support. Accounts from 13th century English abbeys describe brewing cycles that ran year-round, scaled up in Lent and Advent when food was restricted. During these periods, beer was given freely to those in need. The line between nutrition, hospitality, and charity was blurry. To deny someone a cup was to risk their life. And so, the humble act of brewing became a sacred duty. As twilight darkened the stone cloisters and monks turned toward Compline prayers, the fires in the brewery glowed on. Brewmasters stirred their vats, monks carried buckets of fermenting wort, and steam rose like incense. In the silence, one could almost hear the sacred bubbling of yeast doing its holy work. But brewing was not without its conflicts. What happened when monastic beer became too popular? When outsiders began to prefer the monks' brew to that of local townsfolk? When monasteries profited rather than just provided? These tensions would soon boil over. As monastic brewing matured, so too did its unintended consequences. The act of making beer, once a necessity for spiritual and physical survival, evolved into a powerful economic activity. Across Europe, monasteries perfected the art of fermentation, and their products began attracting attention not only from pilgrims and the poor, but also from paying customers. What had once been considered a spiritual service gradually became a lucrative sideline, and that, inevitably, drew the attention and ire of those outside the monastery walls. From hospitality to commerce, throughout the High Middle Ages, particularly between the 11th and 13th centuries, the reputation of monastic beer began to spread. Pilgrims who received hospitality at abbeys told tales of clean, hearty brews unlike anything they'd tasted in nearby towns. Nobles passing through requested barrels to be sent to their estates. In some cases, breweries within monasteries outproduced and outsold the local, secular alewives and taverns. This was never the monks' initial intention, at least not publicly. Monasteries were bound by religious vows, and outright profit was considered spiritually dangerous. But few could ignore the financial opportunities. If selling beer could help feed more poor, build a hospital wing, or extend the cloister walls, was it not a service to God? So quietly, the vats grew larger. The barrels traveled farther. Monasteries began to offer stronger beer, sometimes under the table for those who could afford it. These brews had longer shelf lives and better flavors due to controlled ingredients and standardized brewing techniques. The result, market disruption. The alewife's anger. For many towns and villages, ale was the domain of women, particularly married women. Known as alewives, these women brewed at the household level and sold their beer to neighbors, passers-by, and local inns. Ale brewing was one of the few economic roles available to women, and it was central to family survival. Enter the monastery with its deep pockets, fertile lands, and well-fed brewing staff. Their beer was reliable, consistent, and often superior in quality. It lasted longer, traveled better, and even appeared more pure due to the perception of holiness attached to the monks. Alewives began to lose customers. Guilds formed to protect their interests. In England, records show brewing guilds petitioning municipal governments to restrict the sale of monastic beer within city walls. In some towns, abbeys were forced to sell only to pilgrims or within certain territories. Monastic brews were accused of undercutting prices, violating market rules, and ironically sinning through excessive profit. One alewife from York, Margaret Aline, brought a complaint to the city bailiffs in 1287, arguing that the local priory was selling strong beer for cheap coin and had stolen her regulars. The monks countered by claiming their beer was given freely. The truth likely lay somewhere in between. Such stories are not rare. They repeated themselves across France, the Low Countries, and Germany. The monks, for their part, didn't always hide behind humility. Some monasteries leaned into brewing's reputation. The Augustinian Abbey of Andechs in Bavaria proudly displayed its brewing capabilities, and by the late 13th century, its beer was being transported across regional borders. Whether they admitted it or not, monks had become part of the economic engine. The regulation of piety. As tensions rose, so did legal scrutiny. Secular rulers, always eager for tax revenue and wary of powerful religious institutions, began passing ordinances to limit monastic influence in local markets. Beer had become taxable. In England, the Assize of Ale, first implemented in the 13th century, established standard prices and quantities for ale. Inspectors called ale-conners were tasked with sampling local beer and ensuring quality control and fair pricing. These officials, sometimes comically depicted in medieval manuscripts sampling too enthusiastically, nonetheless enforced real economic policy. Monasteries were not exempt. They were expected to abide by local laws, even as they claimed divine exemptions. Some abbeys refused, citing ecclesiastical privilege. Others negotiated deals with towns, offering fixed annual payments in exchange for freedom from local regulations. Still others simply ignored the rules and brewed as they pleased after all. What local sheriff would risk excommunication by challenging an abbey? Conflicts escalated. In Ghent, city officials stormed a monastic brewery in 1315, accusing the monks of evading ale taxes. In response, the abbey called upon a local bishop to intercede. A compromise was reached, but only after both sides threatened to escalate matters to the papacy and royal court. These tensions illuminate the peculiar place beer held in medieval life. It was both sacred and secular, both survival and surplus, a beverage and a battleground. Monks as innovators. Amid all this, the monks were improving the product. Monasteries experimented with ingredients, temperature control, and storage techniques. They embraced innovations that their lay counterparts couldn't afford or didn't understand. Cooling beer in stone cellars, monitoring fermentation through observation, and eventually integrating hops. Hops were first mentioned in European brewing in the 9th century, but their widespread adoption took time. They added both bitterness and crucial antimicrobial properties, allowing beer to last longer. Monks, always on the edge of medicinal and herbal knowledge, were early adopters. Records from a Benedictine monastery in what is now Bavaria suggest that by the 12th century, their brews were consistently hopped. These beers were not only safer, they could be shipped. And once beer could be transported over distance, its role shifted again from local staple to regional commodity. And so monastic beer began to feed more than just the monks and the local poor. It fueled economies, invited pilgrimage tourism, and shaped tastes across Europe. The monastic brand had value. The cowl had clout. But not everyone saw this as a spiritual success. Crisis of conscience. By the late medieval period, concerns grew within the church itself. Critics accused some monasteries of becoming too worldly. Where once had stood poverty, now stood cellars filled with aging beer. Where once there was silent prayer, now echoed the clatter of carts bearing barrels for distant markets. Reform movements emerged. The Cistercians, for example, aimed to return monasticism to its austere roots. They reduced brewing operations to focus on prayer and simplicity, condemning what they saw as Benedictine excess. Meanwhile, certain Franciscan factions openly criticized the commercialization of sacred spaces. And yet the popularity of monastic beer endured. Pilgrims continued to seek it out. Nobles sent envoys to collect it. Cities fought over who could sell it. Monastic beer had grown beyond its original purpose. It had become a brand, a tradition, and a force within European commerce. This success, however, raised an uncomfortable question. Had monasteries, in their quest to nourish and survive, unwittingly embraced the very materialism they vowed to reject? As the Middle Ages waned and the early modern world dawned, monastic beer would face new threats: religious reform, secularization, and the sweeping changes of the Reformation. Some abbeys would be dissolved. Others would lose their lands, their breweries shuttered or seized. Yet some would survive, even thrive. How did monastic brewing weather the storm of Reformation? What became of their beer when the cloisters fell silent? When the echoing bell towers of Europe rang in the 16th century, they did so into a world of profound transformation. The Reformation swept across the continent like a rising tide, unmooring monasteries from their long-held authority, dissolving centuries-old religious houses, and with them, often unnoticed, extinguishing many of the breweries that had for generations quenched the thirsts of monks, peasants, and pilgrims alike. But some embers endured. This final section traces the fate of monastic brewing through the Reformation, Counter-Reformation, Enlightenment, and into the modern age. It's a story not only of loss, but of survival, of how low-alcohol beer, once a humble monastic staple, persisted beyond cloisters and commandments. The Reformation's reckoning. The brewing monks of the late medieval world had reached an apex of influence and output. But in many places, particularly in Northern and Central Europe, that success would soon count against them. When Martin Luther published his 95 Theses in 1517, protesting abuses within the Catholic Church, his challenge to religious authority soon grew into a widespread movement of reform. Monasteries seen by many Protestants as centers of superstition, corruption, and wealth became targets for dissolution. Between 1536 and 1541 in England, for example, Henry VIII oversaw the dissolution of the monasteries, stripping over 800 monastic houses of their lands, treasures, and brewing facilities. The brewing kettles were sold, the cellars emptied, the manuscripts auctioned or burned. Monks were evicted or forced into secular life. Many of the breweries that had sustained communities were lost overnight. In Germany, the situation varied by region. Lutheran territories shuttered their monasteries, Catholic regions retained them. But even where monasteries survived, they faced new restrictions. The idea that monks should not compete with lay brewers gained fresh momentum, bolstered by Protestant ethics and early capitalist ideology. One of the most poignant casualties was the Benedictine Abbey of Cluny in France. Once one of the wealthiest and most influential monastic institutions in Europe, it had a sophisticated brewing operation that supported local communities and travelers. By the late 18th century, Cluny was in ruins, its stones sold off, its beer forgotten. What was once sacred was now suspect. The Counter-Reformation and brewing revival. But Catholic Europe did not surrender so easily. In the wake of Protestant critiques, the Catholic Church mounted the Counter-Reformation, a campaign of spiritual, institutional, and educational renewal. Part of this included reviving monastic life, but with stricter rules and greater humility. Brewing endured, though it shifted subtly. Monasteries that retained their brewing operations increasingly emphasized their traditional, spiritual purposes. Brewing was recast not as an economic endeavor, but a continuation of ancient hospitality. Monks framed their beer as both heritage and health, essential to self-sufficiency and service, not indulgence. In regions like Bavaria and Flanders, this reframing allowed certain monasteries not only to survive, but to strengthen their reputations. Abbeys like Andechs, Weltenberg, and Westmalle refined their recipes, producing both low-alcohol table beers for internal consumption and stronger varieties for sale. Trappist monks, a particularly austere Cistercian order, became guardians of brewing purity. In 1836, the Trappist Abbey of Westmalle in Belgium brewed its first beer for consumption beyond its walls. Others followed suit. The Trappist approach was distinct, brewing not for profit but for sustenance, charity, and monastic maintenance. Any excess revenue was and still is used for community welfare or reinvested in the abbey. Thus, the beer survived the Reformation, but it was no longer merely a daily drink. It was heritage. The rise of secular brewing. Even as some monasteries held fast to their kettles, the brewing world outside the cloisters was undergoing massive change. By the 17th and 18th centuries, brewing was increasingly industrialized. Secular brewers adopted techniques pioneered by monks: hopping, temperature control, sanitation, and built upon them. Cities like Munich, London, and Prague became brewing powerhouses, pushing monastic beer further into the realm of nostalgia. At the same time, the health rationale for beer began to fade. Improved sanitation, better understanding of disease transmission, and the advent of public water systems in the 19th century meant that beer was no longer a required substitute for hydration. Tap water was safer. Tea and coffee, imported through global trade, became new staples. Beer became choice, not necessity. In response, monastic brewers pivoted. Their beers became more flavorful, stronger, and less everyday. The low-alcohol small beer of medieval monks gradually gave way to richer, celebratory brews double, tripel, quadrupel. The idea of beer as a sacred, daily act of survival disappeared into history. But the story wasn't over. Endurance through modernity. Despite wars, revolutions, and reformations, a handful of monastic breweries survived into the 20th and 21st centuries. Some continuously operated since the Middle Ages. To protect the authenticity of monastic brewing, the International Trappist Association was formed in 1997. It established criteria for what could be labeled authentic Trappist product, requiring that the beer be brewed within a Trappist monastery. Monks be involved in its production. Profits go toward monastic upkeep and charitable causes. As of today, there are fewer than a dozen recognized Trappist breweries in the world, including Westvleteren, Belgium; Chimay, Belgium; La Trappe, Netherlands; Spencer, USA, now closed; Trefontaine, Italy. These breweries produce some of the world's most revered beers, rich in flavor, history, and spiritual symbolism. Though many no longer make the low-alcohol small beer that once hydrated entire monastic communities, the ethos remains. Every bottle of Trappist beer sold today echoes the cloistered halls, the cold stone floors, and the quiet devotion of monks stirring steaming vats at dawn. A modern reflection, from survival to symbol. What then is the legacy of monastic beer? It's not simply the survival of a beverage, it's the survival of a way of thinking, the transformation of necessity into culture, the mundane hydration elevated into a ritual. In modern times, the idea that beer could be both sacred and ordinary seems foreign. But for nearly a millennium, it was central to daily life, particularly in the West. Monastic beer offers a lesson in adaptation. When water was unsafe, the monks brewed. When critics accused them of profit, they redefined their purpose. When secularization threatened their way of life, they held fast to their rituals. And when the modern world seemed ready to forget, they leaned into tradition. So the next time you see a dusty bottle labeled Trappist, or read of ancient abbeys still fermenting behind their walls, remember this. It began not in a tap room, not in a bar, but in the cold, disciplined kitchens of monks who needed a way to survive, to nourish, and to serve. And all of it, every pint began with a single, desperate problem. How do you stay alive when the water can kill you? Story 2. Alewives and Households, Women's Role in Medieval Brewing. Before breweries became institutions, and before monks stirred vast cauldrons in stone monasteries, there was the home, and in the home, there was the woman, often standing at a bubbling pot near the hearth. In medieval Europe, beer began not in the cloisters but in the kitchen. The story of brewing is, in its earliest and most widespread form, a story of women, ordinary women, wives, widows, and daughters, whose livelihoods and households depended on the humble craft of fermentation. While history has long focused on kings and wars, the daily labor of medieval women, especially in domestic brewing, was a quiet engine of survival and community. Long before it became a commercial industry, beer was women's work. This section explores that domestic space where alewives boiled, stirred, and sold their brews in backyards and corners of bustling markets. It is not the history of great figures or monumental wars, but of ordinary resilience and the overlooked expertise of everyday life. The medieval home as brewery. In medieval towns and villages, nearly every household brewed its own ale. There was no clear division between food and drink preparation. Both took place near the same hearth, in pots that often served multiple purposes. Brewing was a household necessity, like baking bread or tending livestock. Women, particularly married women, were responsible for food preparation, and this naturally included brewing. The ale they produced was usually consumed within a few days, as preservation techniques were limited and refrigeration was non-existent. Freshness was essential. The cycle repeated: regularly grind the grain, heat the mash, ferment, serve, and start again. This home-based ale was called small beer or mild ale, low in alcohol and rich in calories. It was consumed by all members of the household, including children and the elderly. In times of scarcity, it might be the most reliable source of nutrition. Few of these women called themselves brewers. It was simply what needed to be done. But when surplus was possible, some women began selling their excess beer. Thus, the alewife emerged not as a formal title, but as a practical extension of household labor into the local economy. Who were the alewives? An alewife was a woman who brewed and sold beer, either from her home or in local markets. These women were often married but could also be widows, unmarried women, or female heads of household. In a time when few employment opportunities existed for women, brewing offered both income and independence. Some alewives sold directly from their homes. Others ran small, informal taverns or served ale from a bench outside their door. The operation was modest, often involving little more than a bench, a barrel, and a sign, sometimes a broomstick or a branch, to signal that beer was available. In England, for example, alewives might work under the watchful eye of the local manorial court, which licensed them to sell beer and ensured they adhered to quality and pricing standards. Violations could result in fines, but enforcement was inconsistent. Across Europe, similar patterns existed. In France, brasseuses worked in both rural and urban settings. In German towns, brewing guilds occasionally admitted women, though more often they remained informal or semi-legal participants in the market. Alewives held a precarious status. They were vital providers in their communities, feeding and hydrating neighbors, travelers, and workers. But they also faced suspicion, scorn, and sometimes accusations of greed, witchcraft, or immorality. Why? Because brewing was not just about nourishment, it was also about money, control, and public space. Brewing and the female economy. Selling beer offered women a rare form of financial agency. In a society where property ownership, legal standing, and labor opportunities were overwhelmingly male-dominated, brewing allowed women to earn and manage money. For some, it was the difference between poverty and survival. Records from 14th century Norwich show that many licensed brewers were women. In 1 year alone, more than 70% of the names listed in local brewing rolls were female. Some brewed only a few times per year, others were near-permanent fixtures of the market. The proceeds could pay for necessities: bread, clothing, firewood, or rent. For widows and single women, it was sometimes their only income. But money brings scrutiny. Alewives who became successful often drew suspicion. Their success was seen as unseemly, especially when it outpaced that of their male counterparts. Satirical poems and morality plays portrayed alewives as dishonest, loud, and vulgar. One famous example is The Tunning of Eleanor Rumming, a 16th century poem by John Skelton, which describes a grotesque and immoral alewife whose customers include drunks and deviants. Such depictions reveal more about societal discomfort with female independence than about actual misconduct. And yet, despite mockery and regulation, the alewives kept brewing. Brewing equipment and methods. The tools of the alewife were simple but effective. Mash tun, a large tub or barrel used to soak crushed grain in hot water. Boiling vessel, often a cauldron or pot used to boil the wort unfermented beers. Fermentation vessel, an open container left near the hearth or in a cellar to allow natural fermentation. Storage casks, wooden barrels for serving and short-term storage. In many cases, these were repurposed kitchen or farming tools. Brewing didn't require specialized equipment, it was an extension of daily domestic labor. Recipes were passed down orally, with little formal instruction. The quality of the ale depended on local grain, water purity, ambient yeast, and the brewer's experience. Flavoring agents varied. Before hops became widespread, ale was often seasoned with herbs and spices gruit including yarrow, sage, and rosemary. These added bitterness and minor preservative effects. Brewing was unpredictable. Without thermometers, hydrometers, or modern sanitation, results could vary widely. Some batches soured quickly, others remained drinkable for days. The alewife's skill was in her attentiveness, watching the temperature, judging the fermentation by smell or foam, and reacting quickly to changes. It was labor-intensive, physically demanding work that required judgment and memory. The alewife and the community. Despite their challenges, alewives were deeply embedded in community life. They served the builders who constructed homes, the shepherds who herded flocks, and the pilgrims who passed through on dusty roads. Their ale fueled harvests, celebrations, and religious festivals. They knew the gossip, held the keys to social spaces, and connected households. In small villages, they might be one of only a few people providing drinkable sustenance beyond water or milk. Their ale was not merely a beverage, it was survival, especially during food shortages or when water sources were unreliable. They were mothers, widows, and workers, and they did it all with little formal recognition. But even as they labored, the world around them was changing. By the 15th and 16th centuries, brewing was becoming more professionalized. Men were entering the trade in greater numbers. Guilds grew more powerful. Taxes increased. Legal requirements multiplied. And slowly, alewives began to disappear. What caused the decline of the alewife? Was it competition, regulation, or cultural pressure? Or did technological change simply outpace the domestic brewer? The next section will explore the forces that pushed brewing from the hearth to the brewhouse, and the fatting legacy of the women who once kept villages alive, one barrel at a time. In the dim corners of bustling medieval taverns and the open-air markets that rang with trade and gossip, the alewife once reigned. But by the end of the 16th century, her domain had begun to shrink. What had been a household art passed from mother to daughter was increasingly claimed by men, guilds, and growing commercial enterprises. The story of brewing was no longer domestic, it was professional, public, and regulated. And the women who once stirred the wort and poured the ale were steadily written out of the story. This section explores how brewing shifted from the hands of women to the halls of men, and how economic, legal, and cultural forces contributed to the slow disappearance of the alewife. Guilds and the professionalization of brewing. As European towns expanded in the later Middle Ages, commerce grew more organized. Craft guilds formed to regulate trades, protect economic interests, and set standards. Among them, brewing guilds gained power particularly in urban centers where consistent quality and taxation were priorities. These guilds were overwhelmingly male. They required formal apprenticeships, entry fees, and public registration barriers that excluded most women, especially those brewing informally at home. While some guilds allowed widows of guild members to continue operations temporarily, this was the exception, not the rule. In cities like London, Paris, and Cologne, brewing moved from homes to dedicated brewhouses. These were larger, more capital-intensive operations that brewed in bulk, employed workers, and served wider markets. Alewives, with their modest production and limited resources, could not compete at scale. As the brewing process itself grew more complex, especially with the introduction of hops and longer fermentation cycles, it required greater investment and space. Open fires in the hearth gave way to dedicated brick brewing stoves. Storage needs multiplied, and male brewers with guild backing had better access to resources, legal protections, and distribution networks. The center of brewing moved from the home to the market square. The legal squeeze. Simultaneously, alewives found themselves increasingly hemmed in by regulations. In England, the assize of ale had existed since the 13th century, setting prices and enforcing quality standards. But as brewing became commercial, enforcement became stricter. Ale Connor's official tasters appointed by towns visited alewives more frequently and issued harsher penalties for weak or spoiled brews. The burden of compliance fees, inspections, penalties fell more heavily on small-scale brewers than on wealthier, male-run brewhouses. In some regions, women were even banned from brewing altogether. A 15th-century brewing ordinance from Norwich, for instance, states, "No woman shall henceforth brew ale for sale unless she be the wife or widow of a freeman of the craft." Such laws formalized exclusion. A practice once born from necessity and skill became inaccessible through bureaucracy. And the penalties could be harsh. Public shamming, fines, and even temporary imprisonment were not uncommon. Women were often fined more than men for the same brewing violations, reflecting both gender bias and the precarious position of women in the public economy. The witch-brewer connection. As if legal and economic obstacles weren't enough, cultural forces were also at play. Alewives, especially those working independently, became the target of suspicion and satire. They were depicted in plays and sermons as greedy, dishonest, and immoral. The satirical image of the alewife often included exaggerated features, crooked noses, hunchbacks, warts, and her ale was portrayed as foul or watered down. These depictions, while comical on the surface, carried darker undertones. In some regions, alewives became associated with witchcraft. Why? Because they used herbs and secret recipes, because they worked alone, because they served men in semi-public spaces, and because they wielded unusual economic independence. The trappings of brewing, the tall conical hats worn for visibility in crowded markets, the cats that protected grain stores from vermin, the bubbling cauldrons over open flames all easily slid into the emerging imagery of the witch. Though not every alewife was accused of sorcery, the stereotype fed into a broader narrative of female suspicion. Independence, skill, and social visibility were dangerous traits for women in patriarchal societies. So the alewife, once a vital figure in community life, became a caricature and sometimes a scapegoat. The rise of hopped beer and its impact. Another key factor in the shift away from household brewing was the growing popularity of hopped beer. Hops were introduced into Western European brewing as early as the 9th century, but it wasn't until the 14th and 15th centuries that they gained widespread acceptance. Unlike traditional gruit-based ales, hopped beers lasted longer, traveled better, and were more resistant to spoilage. But they also took longer to brew. Hopped beer required more precise temperature control, extended fermentation time, and a more stable storage environment. This made it less suitable for quick, home-based brewing and more aligned with commercial operations. Alewives who brewed fast turnaround batches from the hearth could not easily switch to the hopped process. Male-dominated breweries, with the resources to adopt new techniques, gained a technological advantage. In time, unhopped ale came to be seen as rustic or old-fashioned, while hopped beer became modern and profitable. The vocabulary itself began to shift. Alewife was associated with lower quality. Brewer became the respectable masculine term. And so the language erased them too. The decline of the alewife. By the 17th century, the presence of alewives had diminished dramatically in many European cities. Where once they lined the streets with benches and barrels, they were now a rarity pushed to rural margins or absorbed into male-run businesses. Widows still occasionally brewed, often as a stopgap after the death of a husband. But few women entered the trade anew. The household brewery, once a core site of economic activity and female expertise, faded into memory. brewing became a man's profession. And yet the alewives did not vanish entirely. In some rural areas, home brewing by women persisted well into the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly in Scandinavia, the British Isles, and parts of Eastern Europe. There, beer remained part of domestic life, though increasingly marginalized by factory production and state regulation. Even in decline, their legacy lingered. A legacy in foam. The story of the alewife is not just about beer, it is about women's labor, autonomy, and resilience in the face of changing economies and social expectations. For centuries, women brewed not for prestige, but for sustenance, survival, and community. Their knowledge was passed hand to hand, kitchen to kitchen, quietly shaping the taste of European life. They nourished families, funded households, and built informal networks of trade. When brewing moved into male hands, it gained capital but lost its memory of them. Today, the modern craft beer movement occasionally nods toward this lost history. Some breweries revive the term alewife as a tribute. Others explore medieval brewing techniques or feature women brewers prominently. But in most histories, the women who kept beer flowing for hundreds of years are mere footnotes. What might have happened if the guilds had welcomed them, if the regulations had adapted, if society had embraced the alewife instead of mocking her? In the next section, we'll explore the faint but persistent echoes of the alewife across Europe, and into modern times how fragments of their traditions lived on in folk brewing, rural customs, and modern revivals. Even in silence, the alewife left a mark on the world. As the alewife receded from the bustling marketplaces and quiet hearths of medieval Europe, her influence didn't vanish. It seeped into the roots of cultural memory, persisted in forgotten customs, and occasionally flickered back to life in regions where traditions moved slower than the march of modernization. In this final section, we explore how the memory of women brewers survived across centuries of silence through rural customs, folk brewing, oral knowledge, and, in more recent decades, conscious revival. Though her presence diminished in written records, the alewife never truly disappeared. Instead, she went underground, fermenting quietly, like a well-tended wort. Rural resilience, where alewives lingered. In cities, the rise of professional male brewers and guild restrictions pushed women out of the trade. But in the countryside, where formal regulation came slowly and communities remained self-reliant, women continued to brew, often in ways unchanged since the Middle Ages. In Scandinavia, for instance, homebrewing remained a central part of rural life well into the 19th and even early 20th centuries. In Sweden and Norway, it was common for women to produce Juleal Christmas beer using traditional wooden vessels, farmhouse yeasts, and age-old recipes passed down through generations. These brews were consumed at seasonal festivals, weddings, and funerals. In Finland, sahti, a rustic, unfiltered beer brewed with juniper and farmhouse yeast, was long the domain of women. Each village had its own variation, and brewing knowledge was protected as family heritage. In some households, grandmothers retained the authority to declare when the beer was ready or acceptable for sharing. Similarly, in the Scottish Highlands and Ireland, traditional farmhouse brewing persisted, especially in isolated regions. Ale was brewed with wild herbs, bog myrtle or heather, echoing the pre-hop ales of medieval gruit. Often, these brewers were women, working outside of commercial scrutiny. Here, ale remained what it had always been: nourishment, ritual, and community glue. Brewing as ritual and memory. The act of brewing in these communities often took on ritual significance. It wasn't just about creating a beverage. It was a social performance, an expression of continuity. The brewing day was an event. Friends and neighbors came to help or observe. The smell of boiling mash, the creak of wooden barrels, and the quiet bubbling of fermentation were part of the household rhythm. These brews were rarely written down. Recipes lived in the hands and memory. A handful of grain, a feel for water temperature, a smell of readiness, these were tools of a craft that was never professionalized, only practiced. In oral tradition, some of these women brewers became local legends. Their names did not make it into official records, but their beer lived on in stories. She brewed the strongest, people might say, of a grandmother or village elder. Only her ale could keep you warm through winter. In these spaces, the alewife endured not as caricature, but as cornerstone. The silence in history. Despite these continuities, formal history largely forgot the alewife. By the 18th and 19th centuries, brewing had become heavily industrialized. Large-scale breweries dominated production. Advertising, distribution, and logistics became more important than flavor or community. Beer, once local and familiar, was now mass-produced. The brewing profession was recast as masculine, scientific, and commercial. Women's brewing was increasingly framed as old-fashioned, imprecise, or even unsanitary. Textbooks and brewing manuals written by men ignored or dismissed the generations of knowledge passed through women's hands. Universities that taught brewing admitted few, if any, women. The alewife became a relic, her image occasionally revived in Halloween costumes or pub signs, but rarely with dignity or depth. And yet, even in silence, something lingered. The revival begins. The late 20th century saw a dramatic shift in the world of brewing. The craft beer movement, born in resistance to homogenized industrial beer, sparked renewed interest in traditional methods, regional styles, and brewing history. In rediscovering old recipes and fermentation techniques, brewers stumbled upon a forgotten truth. Women had once been central to it all. Historians began to dig deeper into court rolls, manorial accounts, and civic records. There, among the faded ink and brittle parchment, the names of women brewers re-emerged. In some English towns, 50 to 80% of licensed brewers in the 14th century were women. In France, women brewers were linked to local saints' festivals. In Belgium, convent records showed nuns producing beer for pilgrims and orphans alike. This rediscovery challenged long-standing narratives and inspired a new generation of female brewers. Across the US, UK, and Europe, women began to enter brewing schools, open craft breweries, and reclaim their place in the field. Some named their ventures in honor of the forgotten brewers, the Alewife Brewing Company, Brasserie des Filles, Lady Brewsters, each a quiet act of historical justice. Professional organizations like the Pink Boots Society, founded in 2007, support women working in the brewing industry. They offer mentorship, education, and visibility, directly linking modern women to a tradition that once thrived in kitchens and market stalls. Even more importantly, brewing is once again happening in homes. The rise of home brewing has led countless people, women included, to reconnect with the intimate, hands-on process of making beer. Many have begun experimenting with medieval recipes, using herbs instead of hops, or adopting fermentation methods that predate industrialization. The alewife, long gone from the public square, now quietly returns in basements, kitchens, and shared community spaces. From margins to memory. What does the story of the alewife teach us? It reminds us that history is not always made in palaces or wars. Sometimes, it happens quietly over a boiling pot beside a smoky hearth, in the exchange of a cup and a coin. Women, though long denied access to formal recognition, were once the keepers of fermentation, the providers of safe drink, and the sustainers of community. Their decline was not inevitable. It was the result of legal decisions, cultural pressures, and economic shifts, and their memory, nearly erased, has taken centuries to piece back together. But now, with growing awareness and intentional revival, the alewife is no longer just a relic. She is a symbol of labor, of tradition, and of resilience. And perhaps the next time you sip a handcrafted ale, brewed with herbs and heart, you'll remember her. Not as a witch or a punchline, but as the woman who kept the village alive. Story 3. A pint for the peasantry, rural life and low alcohol consumption. Imagine a village nestled in a shallow valley, ringed with thatched-roof cottages, ox-plowed fields, and narrow footpaths worn by generations of feet. Smoke curls from open hearths, roosters call in the misty morning, and a stream meanders beyond the common pasture. This is not the world of kings or clergy. It is the world of peasants, the overwhelming majority of people who lived, worked, and died in medieval Europe. Here, beer, more precisely small beer, was not a luxury. It was daily bread in liquid form. It hydrated, nourished, and warmed. It gave weak bodies strength and served as the safest thing one could drink. It was consumed with breakfast, at midday meals in the fields, and before sleep. It was brewed in homes, consumed communally, and never far from thought. In this section, we will step inside the daily rhythms of peasant life and trace the essential role of low-alcohol ale, how it was brewed, when it was drunk, who made it, and why its role was far more vital than the beverage might suggest. Who were the peasants? Before the story of the pint can be told, we must understand the people behind it. Medieval peasants were rural agricultural laborers, a broad term that includes serfs bound to land, cotters, smallholders with limited rights, and free peasants who paid rent or taxes. Though their legal statuses varied, most shared similar daily experiences: toil from dawn to dusk, dependence on landowners, and a life shaped by the seasons. They lived in small villages, typically of no more than a few hundred people, and rarely traveled more than a few miles from their birthplace. Their homes were small, often one-room cottages built of timber and daub, with an open hearth in the center for cooking and warmth. Life was communal and cooperative. Labor was shared at harvest time, tools were borrowed, and stories were exchanged over shared mugs. Into this world, beer, especially low-alcohol beer, was woven into every thread of the day. The importance of small beer. Small beer, or table beer, typically contained between 0.5% and 2% alcohol by volume. It was brewed from the second or even third runnings of a mash, the process of extracting sugars from grain, and was far weaker than the strong ale, sometimes served at feasts or in wealthier homes. This beer was not for celebration, it was for hydration. Water, though not always contaminated in the countryside, could still be unsafe, particularly in densely populated villages, where runoff from livestock and latrines could pollute wells and streams. Boiling water before consumption was not a common practice unless for brewing or soup. Beer, on the other hand, had several advantages. Boiling the mash during brewing killed pathogens. Fermentation created alcohol, which inhibited bacterial growth. Herbs or hops, when used, added further antimicrobial properties. Grain-based, beer provided calories important in an era of constant caloric need. Thus, small beer became the default drink, safer than water, more nutritious than tea, which was unknown, and affordable to make at home. It was served with breakfast porridge, taken to the fields in leather or ceramic jugs, and sipped in the evening while mending tools or spinning wool. It was not just something peasants drank. It was something they needed to live. Brewing in the peasant household. In contrast to urban breweries or monastic operations, rural brewing was typically done on a small, subsistence scale. It was usually a domestic task, carried out by women in or near the home. Brewing vessels were simple: large pots or kettles heated over the hearth, wooden troughs or barrels for fermenting, earthenware jugs or flasks for serving. Brewing might take place once a week or every few days, depending on family size and resources. The grain, often barley, but also wheat, oats, or rye, was soaked, mashed, and sometimes reused for second or third runnings to create a very weak brew suitable for children or elders. Fermentation was often spontaneous, relying on wild yeast from the air or from reused brewing equipment. This led to significant variability in taste and quality. Some batches would sour quickly, others would be surprisingly pleasant. Hops were not common in most rural areas until well into the later Middle Ages. Instead, peasants' grew it, a mix of herbs like mugwort, yarrow, heather, and sometimes rosemary or sage. These local herbs added flavor and mild preservative qualities. Each household had its own method, flavor, and routine. Brewing was passed down like a family recipe, unrecorded but deeply embedded in tradition. Beer and labor, fueling the fields. The agricultural calendar dictated every aspect of peasant life. Spring brought planting, summer meant long days in the field, autumn was harvest, and winter involved repair and preparation. Small beer was present at every stage. During sowing, it sustained the plowmen and planters. During harvest, it was essential for the intense caloric burn of shearing, binding, and storing crops. During winter, it offered warmth and comfort when food stores were tight. Often, landlords or manorial lords provided beer to their peasants during harvest or feast days as a form of payment or incentive. Records from English manors show detailed allocations of ale to workers, sometimes stronger, sometimes weaker, depending on the task. A thresher might be owed a gallon a day. A plowman, too. Women working in flax processing or spinning often received smaller amounts but were still included. Beer was both wage and sustenance. It was the rhythm of work made liquid. Communal drinking and social bonds. Drinking was rarely a solitary act. In villages, beer was consumed communally, shared among families, neighbors, and visitors. It was passed in mugs, served at benches, and poured during village gatherings. Celebrations like harvest feasts, weddings, church festivals, or saints' days were marked by larger batches, sometimes including stronger ale brewed specifically for the occasion. Communal brewing sometimes occurred for such events, where multiple families contributed grain or labor. This collective effort reinforced social ties and mutual dependence. Children, too, drank small beer. Though it may seem odd today, it was a practical choice. The alcohol content was too low to intoxicate, but enough to prevent illness. For a 6-year-old working in the garden or fetching water, a sip of small beer was expected, not exceptional. Beer was not a vice. It was a part of life, as ordinary as bread, as vital as air. The church, the tavern, and the lord. 3 institutions framed peasant life beyond the household: the church, the local tavern or alehouse, and the manorial lord. Each had a relationship with beer. The church often discouraged drunkenness, but tolerated beer as a daily necessity. Some churches even brewed beer for local festivals or gave ale as alms. The tavern, when present in a village, offered a semi-public space where peasants could gather, hear news, and spend leisure time. Ale sold there was often brewed by a local woman or licensed by the manor. The lord might levy taxes on beer or regulate its sale, especially if he held brewing rights, known as banalité in France or brew rights in England. Peasants navigated these structures with care. Brewing for home use was generally permitted, but selling beer could draw scrutiny, especially if it bypassed taxation or encroached on someone else's legal rights. Still, small-scale brewing remained widespread. It was too embedded, too essential, and too decentralized to suppress. A life shaped by brew. For the medieval peasant, beer was not a luxury, a hobby, or an indulgence. It was survival. Its production was a regular chore, its consumption a routine act, its absence a source of concern. When harvests failed, beer helped stretch calories. When winters were cold, it offered warmth. When labor was grueling, it restored strength. And when community was needed, it provided the setting. This quiet, essential presence made beer more than just a drink. It was part of the very structure of rural life. But what happened when brewing techniques advanced? When beer began to travel farther and last longer? When merchants arrived with casks from towns and taverns became more prominent? In the next section, we'll examine how economic and technological changes began to transform the role of beer in the peasant village, and how the humble, homemade brew faced challenges from beyond the hedgerows. By the late medieval period, rural Europe was no longer a world of isolated villages and closed economies. Roads improved, markets grew, and trade flourished. Towns expanded. Traveling merchants and ale sellers carried goods and ideas into even the remotest corners of the countryside. Among those goods were barrels of beer stronger, longer lasting, and brewed in volume far beyond what any peasant hearth could manage. This changing world brought new dynamics to the humble peasant pint. What had once been exclusively a domestic and local endeavor, brewing small beer for one's household, began to shift under the weight of commercial forces. Beer was no longer just nourishment. It was becoming commerce. In this section, we examine how these external pressures transformed village brewing, altered drinking habits, and restructured relationships between peasants, lords, and the growing beer trade. The arrival of the traveling brew. As cities grew, so did their breweries. Urban brewers, often part of powerful guilds, produced beer on a larger scale than any rural family could. Unlike small beer, their brews were often hopped, giving them longer shelf life and a distinctive bitter flavor. These beers could travel. Carters and merchants hauled barrels along trade routes, supplying taverns, fairs, and even manorial courts. Some lords imported beer from nearby towns for their own consumption or for entertaining guests. In time, that beer began appearing in village taverns and alehouses. For many peasants, this was a novelty: stronger beer, darker beer, beer with hops. Its taste was unfamiliar at first. Some found it odd or too bitter. Others found it exciting, a break from the routine, something to mark a holiday or impress visitors. Increased access to commercial beer didn't eliminate household brewing overnight, but it did begin to carve away at its dominance. Taverns and alehouses in the village. With commercial beer came commercial spaces. The tavern, inn, and alehouse each had distinct roles. Alehouses were the most informal, often set up in someone's home, typically a woman. They served home-brewed ale to locals. A broomstick or garland outside the door signaled availability. Taverns were more formal, usually urban, and more likely to serve wine or imported beer. Over time, some villages saw taverns established near churches or market crosses. Inns offered lodging, food, and drink for travelers, and were more common on trade routes. As taverns and alehouses grew more prominent in village life, they slowly centralized what had once been distributed and domestic. Instead of drinking at home or during communal events, peasants might gather at a public house to socialize, hear news, and pay for drink. This shift changed the nature of beer from a shared household staple to a sold commodity, a subtle but important transformation. Lords' taxes and brewing rights. Feudal lords were not slow to notice the economic potential of beer. In many parts of Europe, lords held legal rights over brewing and milling, called banalités in France and brew rights or griths in England. These rights allowed them to regulate and profit from the brewing activities of their tenants. Examples include monopoly rights, forcing peasants to brew only at the lord's brewery. Tolls or taxes on every barrel brewed or sold. Mandatory purchases of ale from the manorial court during festivals. Some lords built their own breweries and employed villagers to work in them. Others licensed brewing to favored individuals in exchange for a portion of the profits. For peasant families, this could be burdensome. Home brewing, once an act of survival and autonomy, now carried economic risks. A family brewing for their own table might face accusations of avoiding taxes or infringing on exclusive rights. As a result, some ceased brewing altogether. Others continued quietly, hiding small barrels in root cellars or pretending their brew was for private use only. The legal climate became increasingly hostile to informal brewing. The shift in ale identity. As the landscape changed, so did the identity of beer itself. Small beer, once the universal drink of peasant households, began to be seen as rustic or inferior, a symbol of poverty, backwardness, or amateurism. Commercial beer, by contrast, gained prestige. It was served at festivals, in courtly households, and on religious feast days. Strong ale, in particular, became a marker of celebration. When villagers scraped together enough coin for a cask, or when a wedding warranted an extra barrel, it was strong beer they sought. In some areas, hopped beer came to be associated with towns, markets, and the wider world, while traditional small beer was increasingly relegated to the domestic sphere. This change wasn't merely practical, it was cultural. Beer was now part of a broader economy and a tool of social distinction. Gender and the loss of brewing knowledge. As beer became more commercial and regulated, women's role in brewing diminished further. Where once brewing had been a skill passed through the hands of peasant mothers and daughters, now it was tied to licenses, taxes, and public establishments. These spheres were often dominated by men. In some cases, women were actively excluded from operating licensed alehouses or taverns. In others, they could only brew under their husband's name. While some persisted, especially widows and older women, many were pushed out of the trade altogether. The long, slow erosion of women's brewing labor continued into rural areas. The hands that once brewed Europe's daily drink were now increasingly absent from the record and from the hearth. What survived was fragmented: a few oral recipes, a worn mash tun, the memory of a grandmother who once brewed every Wednesday. Knowledge slipped away with each passing season. Peasants and the new ale economy. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the ale economy had fully shifted. Villages no longer brewed solely for themselves. Taverns imported barrels from nearby towns. Landlords collected taxes from licensed brewers. Peasant families were more likely to buy beer than make it. At the same time, population growth, enclosure movements, and changing agricultural demands pushed many peasants off traditional lands. Rural poverty increased. Some sought work in towns, including in commercial breweries. Ironically, peasants who had once brewed their own beer for survival now labored for wages to buy the very thing they used to make. The ale that once defined the rhythm of peasant life was now part of a distant economy. And yet some refused to let it go. In certain remote regions, old brewing traditions held on. Secret batches were made. Herbal recipes were whispered. Shared brews appeared at winter feasts and midsummer dances. The spirit of peasant brewing endured in shadows, stories, and stubborn survival. But the age of household beer was passing. What then became of these surviving traditions? Did any of them reach the modern age intact? In the final section of this story, we'll explore the echoes of peasant brewing that remain in folk traditions, rural Europe, and even the craft beer revival where old flavors sometimes find new homes. As the centuries turned and the rural world transformed under the weight of modernization, the peasant brewer, the maker of simple, essential, low-alcohol beer, faded into obscurity. But not completely. Though brewing shifted into commercial and urban hands, fragments of traditional peasant brewing endured. They lingered in remote villages, holiday rituals, oral recipes, and the stubborn rhythms of seasonal life. They even inspired the imaginations of brewers centuries later, who sought to revive the forgotten flavors of the pre-industrial pint. In this final section, we trace the survival of peasant brewing traditions from the post-medieval period into the modern age. We'll visit the places where small beer never quite died, and where, even now, echoes of the old ways bubble to life again. Peasant brewing in decline, 17th to 19th century. By the 17th century, most of Europe's beer was produced commercially. Urban breweries served a growing consumer population. Rural taverns increasingly sourced their beer from regional producers. Taxation and brewing rights were standardized under national laws, discouraging unlicensed home production. Still, in isolated communities, especially in Scandinavia, the British Isles, the Baltics, and Eastern Europe, traditional homebrewing persisted. In Sweden, farmhouses continued to brew Läderöl, light beer, and Svagdricka, weak drink, often under the supervision of elder women. These low-alcohol beers remained a staple during harvest festivals and holidays well into the 19th century. In Scotland, the tradition of brewing Bara, a type of six-row barley ale, survived on the Orkney Islands and in the Highlands, where oral recipes and herbal additives like heather, myrtle, or meadowsweet continued to be used. In Finland, the farmhouse ale known as sahti endured unfiltered, cloudy, fermented with baking yeast and flavored with juniper. It was, and still is, considered a living beer, often brewed without commercial intent and consumed quickly. What these traditions shared was continuity. They were brewed not to sell, not to innovate, but to maintain a way of life. Recipes were memorized, passed along in the doing, not in writing. The beers were weak by modern standards, but rich in calories, culture, and connection. These were the true descendants of the medieval peasant pint. Memory and myth, the folklore of the brew. As brewing moved out of the household, its memory often passed into folklore. In some regions, brewing days became associated with omens and rituals. In 18th century rural Germany, it was said that failure to properly bless the mash would invite brew sprites to spoil the batch. In parts of Ireland, a brewing woman might tie red thread to her brewing spoon to ward off jealousy or bad luck from other women. These stories served multiple functions. They preserved knowledge. They created boundaries between skilled and unskilled brewing, and they offered a way to explain failure in an era of mysterious yeasts and unpredictable fermentation. Songs and sayings also captured brewing centrality to rural life. An Old English rhyme goes, "Strong ale and small, a brew for all, on feast or frost, or field and fall." Even in literature, echoes remained. In Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the miller and wife of Bath make reference to drinking habits common among the working class. And in the plays of Shakespeare, ale flows freely among peasants and nobility alike, often with a nod to its moral or medicinal role. By the time these cultural references were being penned, however, the world that created them was already receding. Forgotten, then found, the craft beer reawakening. The industrialization of beer in the 19th and 20th centuries brought about the dominance of pale lagers, filtered and pasteurized for shelf stability. Local brewing knowledge, especially low alcohol and herbal brewing traditions, was dismissed as backwards. But in the 1970s and 1980s, a quiet rebellion began. The craft beer movement sparked in the UK, US, and continental Europe sought to revive older styles, rediscover forgotten techniques, and reclaim beer's diversity. In doing so, some brewers turned to the peasant past for inspiration. Brewers experimented with low-alcohol table beers, recreating the small beers once brewed for families and workers. Others revived herbal gruit blends, using mugwort, yarrow, and spruce tips. Some looked to Scandinavian farmhouse brewing, reviving Kveik yeasts and raw ale techniques. In Belgium, monastic and rustic styles like saison and grisette, traditionally brewed for miners and farmhands, found new popularity. Historical brewing guides such as Andrew Board's A Dietary of Health, 1542, which discusses the benefits of different ale types, were mined for insights. Even the idea of beer as daily sustenance, not just weekend indulgence, began to resurface. The growth of non-alcoholic or low ABV table beers in recent years has ties to these historical brews offering nourishment without intoxication. Though these revivals are modern interpretations, they reconnect us to the central truth that for most of human history, beer was not a luxury, but a necessity. What remains today? Traces of peasant brewing live on not just in recipes, but in values. Local production, minimal ingredients, community-centered consumption, seasonal rhythms. Some rural festivals still feature small-scale ceremonial brews. In Northern Europe, family breweries maintain ancient recipes. In the Baltics, traditional Kojualu, Estonian farmhouse ale, and Alus, Latvian, are still brewed for family gatherings, especially around solstice holidays. And around the world, new generations of homebrewers are rediscovering what it means to create beer from the land, from simple tools, and from inherited knowledge. It is, in a way, a return to the village, a remembering of what it means to share a brew not for profit, not for spectacle, but for life. The final sip. The history of rural, low-alcohol beer is a history of human endurance, of bodies that needed hydration when water failed, of hands that knew the feel of good mash, of lives shaped not by conquest, but by repetition, planting, brewing, reaping, resting. Peasants brewed because they had to. They brewed with what they had. They brewed not for glory, but for survival. And though their tools have rusted, and their songs have softened, something of their spirit remains. So the next time you taste a mild beer, or hear the word small ale, you might pause not just to drink, but to remember. Behind that cup is 1,000 years of work. Not noble work. Necessary work. Story 4. City thirst, urban infrastructure, and ale dependency. In the tangled alleys of medieval cities, amid the soot, stench, and ceaseless bustle of humanity, thirst was constant. Not just for knowledge or opportunity, but for simple hydration, something clean, safe, and sustaining. Yet the water running through cities was often too dangerous to drink. From London to Lübeck, from Paris to Prague, cities teemed with people but lacked the infrastructure to provide one thing every person needed: potable water. Into this void stepped ale, not just as refreshment, but as necessity. In the urban world of the Middle Ages, beer was more than a beverage. It was an infrastructural solution to a basic biological need. In this section, we explore how the medieval city's layout, its population density, and its sanitation problems created a deep dependence on low-alcohol beverages, and how brewers became crucial figures in the machinery of urban survival. The medieval city, water's worst enemy. To understand the importance of beer in urban life, we must first consider the problem of water. Unlike rural villages which might have clean access to springs, wells, or small brook, cities were chaotic environments. Thousands of people, animals, trades, and waste systems operated in close quarters. Sanitation was rudimentary. Sources of urban water included public wells, shared by dozens of households; streams or rivers, often polluted downstream by tanners, butchers, and latrines; rainwater cisterns, limited and unreliable; conduits, stone or lead pipes that brought water from springs outside the city, rare and expensive. The same river that brought water in also carried sewage out, and when rainfall failed, water supplies dwindled and contamination intensified. Historical records frequently describe outbreaks of waterborne disease, dysentery, cholera-like illnesses, and general gastrointestinal distress. In London, the Thames functioned as both a lifeline and a hazard. Paris's Seine, while majestic, bore the waste of thousands. Thus, beer became the default beverage not because of drunkenness, but because it was boiled and fermented, and therefore safer. The brewing boom. In response to this need, urban brewing exploded in the High Middle Ages, c. 1100–1400. Beer was no longer just the product of homes or monasteries, it became a commercial craft. Breweries, often family-run, dotted the cityscape. In Bruges, 13th century records mention over 500 registered brewers. In London, the Worshipful Company of Brewers was chartered in 1438. In Hamburg, brewing was the largest industry by the 14th century. These urban brewers produced large volumes of small beer, low in alcohol but high in safety and nutrition. This beer was consumed by workers on break in shops or yards, apprentices in their masters' homes, children who sipped from the same mugs as their parents, the elderly, infirm, and poor, who relied on it during times of scarcity. Larger breweries developed more consistent techniques, improved boiling, better grain sourcing, and more stable yeast handling. Many began adopting hops, which extended shelf life and allowed the beer to travel or store more reliably. The infrastructure of brewing. Brewing required water, but not for drinking, for boiling, cooling, and cleaning. Urban brewers, therefore, became major water users. They secured access to wells or streams, sometimes through exclusive charters. In some cities, they were permitted to draw water directly from municipal sources. In Leiden, a brewing canal, the Brouwersgracht, was reserved specifically for brewers' use. In Ghent, municipal records show that brewers negotiated fiercely for clean water rights even more than bakers or butchers. Because beer was so essential, cities often protected brewers from supply interruptions. During sieges or droughts, beer production took precedence over other water-consuming activities. Brewers were also early adopters of wastewater management. To maintain quality, they diverted their spent mash and brewing runoff away from living quarters. Some cities required brewers to locate near waste channels or outside city walls to prevent fouling the air. Inadvertently, brewing began pushing cities toward basic public health measures. Ale as a laborer's lifeline. Urban workers, carpenters, weavers, blacksmiths, masons performed exhausting physical labor. They required calories, hydration, and something easy on the stomach. Small beer provided all three. A typical mug of small beer offered 100–150 calories. Mild antiseptic properties. Carbohydrates for energy. Slight alcohol 0.52% for relaxation. Workshops often included beer in the daily wage. Apprentices, notoriously underfed, relied on beer for survival. In guild contracts, board and beer was a common phrase indicating not just meals, but guaranteed hydration. Even prisoners and paupers received beer. In Paris, charitable hospitals provided diluted ale to patients. In London, the Bridewell prison served beer as part of the daily ration. In this way, beer was infrastructure. Not just liquid, it was logistics. Women, men, and the city brew. In cities, the role of women in brewing shifted. Where rural brewing had long been female-dominated, urban brewing became increasingly male-controlled. This was due in part to guild restrictions that limited membership to men, taxation and licensing fees that favored wealthier, male-run operations, larger batch sizes and equipment, which required more capital. Still, women persisted, especially in alewife houses and unlicensed brewing. Urban alewives brewed in small quantities, sold directly to neighbors, and often served ale from a bench or window. These women were frequently fined or inspected by civic authorities, but they filled a vital niche, providing beer where larger brewers could not. In areas like London's Southwark or York's Shambles, alewives maintained strong community ties. Though marginalized, they remained essential in meeting demand. Some even formed informal networks, pooling grain, sharing fermentation vessels, or taking turns brewing. But slowly, these women were edged out by larger, male-run breweries with better connections, deeper pockets, and guild protections. Beer and the burghers. As beer's importance grew, so did its symbolic power. Burghers, the rising urban middle class, used beer to express identity and status. Hosting feasts with strong beer, owning shares in breweries, or securing exclusive brewing rights became signs of civic clout. Cities like Munich and Nuremberg began to regulate beer not just for safety, but for reputation. Laws were passed dictating allowed ingredients, leading to purity laws like Bavaria's Reinheitsgebot in 1516. Approved alcohol strength for certain populations. Standard pricing for city beer. Beer became a way for cities to project order, a regulated product that reflected civic pride. A city dependent. By the dawn of the 15th century, urban populations across Europe were wholly dependent on beer. The scale of brewing had grown vast. Some cities produced tens of thousands of barrels annually. No alternative was as reliable. Water remained unsafe. Milk was perishable. Wine was expensive. Beer was everyday. This dependency shaped urban design, labor relations, gender roles, and even municipal governance. Without beer, cities could not function, and everyone knew it. But what happened when beer production faltered? What did cities do in times of plague, war, or famine? How did they protect their most vital drink from corruption or collapse? In the next section, we'll explore beer during crisis, how cities protected, rationed, and regulated their brews when survival was on the line. In the dense and precarious world of medieval cities, beer was not merely a drink, it was a stabilizing force. When things went wrong, and they often did, beer became both a refuge and a flashpoint. Cities in the Middle Ages were uniquely vulnerable to disruption. Disease could sweep through in days. Sieges could isolate communities for weeks. Fire, famine, and political unrest could unravel city life with little warning. In such moments of stress, the continuity of beer production was not a luxury, it was a necessity. This section examines how cities managed their ale production during crises. It reveals how brewers became essential service providers, how authorities rationed beer like a precious resource, and how ordinary people clung to a cloudy mug of small ale as a form of stability when all else faltered. Plague and the brewing cauldron. No medieval crisis was more feared than the Black Death, which swept through Europe beginning in 1347 and returned in waves for centuries. In plague-stricken cities, beer served multiple roles. It was safer than water, at a time when fear of contamination gripped the populace. It was a comfort, offering mild sedation and familiarity. It provided nutrition, especially when food chains broke down. Breweries, however, were deeply affected. As workers died or fled, production faltered. In some cases, beer became scarce and prices rose. Guilds petitioned city governments to allow exceptions for hiring untrained labor or to relax regulations to keep beer flowing. In Florence, London, and Lubeck, city councils issued emergency orders ensuring that beer production continued even under quarantine. Workers were sometimes sequestered in breweries, allowed to live and work on site to avoid spreading or contracting disease. Some monasteries stepped in to fill the gap, distributing weak ale as charity when public supply failed. Others used beer to treat the ill not as a cure, but as a soothing and mildly antiseptic liquid when water was suspect and wine unavailable. The association between beer and resilience during plague years became culturally ingrained. Sieges and strategic brewing. In times of war, cities often came under siege, their gates closed, their food stores guarded, and their water supplies threatened. Brewing in these conditions was both difficult and crucial. Cities like Carcassonne, Rothenburg, and Tournai maintained emergency grain stores not just for bread, but for brewing. Ale provided a non-perishable liquid food, a way to stretch grain supplies further than bread could, a morale booster for both civilians and soldiers. Historical accounts describe citizens rallying around brewers, urging them to keep the kettles hot even when firewood was scarce. In some cities, water sources were poisoned or controlled by besiegers, making boiled and fermented beverages the only safe hydration. Beer rations were issued alongside grain and firewood. In Besançon, city ledgers from a 15th century siege record daily allocations of weak beer to women, children, and the infirm, an early example of nutritional triage. Military planners recognized beer's value too. Some cities built fortified breweries within their walls to ensure supply during conflict. These were protected like armories. Fire, flood, and alehouses refuge. Urban fires were a constant threat in medieval cities built of timber, thatch, and tightly packed dwellings. When flames swept through neighborhoods, alehouses often became temporary shelters. Why? Because alehouses were sometimes built of sturdier materials, stone, brick, had open space and benches, were central meeting places known to all. In York and Cologne, surviving alehouses became impromptu gathering points for distributing relief, organizing reconstruction, and sharing information. Floods, too, disrupted brewing. Contaminated wells, ruined grain, and damaged equipment halted production. In Bruges, after the 1369 flood, local officials allocated municipal funds to rebuild damaged breweries before repairing roads or homes, a striking sign of ale's centrality. After disasters, beer was often the first normal thing people sought. A fresh pint meant life went on. Beer riots and political brewing. Despite its calming role, beer could also spark unrest. When prices rose or quality declined or taxes increased, urban populations responded swiftly. Beer riots were not uncommon. In London, 1381, during the Peasants' Revolt, protesters stormed taverns and government storehouses, accusing authorities of hoarding good ale and taxing the poor. In Ghent, 1450, brewers who were seen as colluding with the ruling class were attacked during a bread and beer shortage. Authorities learned to tread carefully. Ale was not just a commodity, it was a symbol of fairness. Everyone, rich or poor, expected access to clean, cheap beer. If that expectation broke, so did public order. Some cities, like Nuremberg, established maximum price laws for beer. Others controlled distribution directly, using civic brewhouses to ensure equitable access. The politics of beer were not about alcohol, they were about trust. The brewer as first responder. In times of peace, the brewer was a craftsman. In times of crisis, he and sometimes she became something more. Essential worker, health provider, public servant. Brewers were granted exemptions from labor drafts during sieges. They were given priority access to grain in famines. They were protected by guard rotations in riots. In Augsburg, a city chronicle from 1496 notes that during a month-long water contamination crisis, local brewers labored without rest to provide ale to the poor and old. Civic officials honored them with special banners in the Corpus Christi, parade a rare recognition for tradesmen. It was not romanticism, it was survival. A barrel of continuity. In the chaotic churn of urban medieval life, beer offered something rare, continuity. Its presence marked the ordinary, its absence the exceptional. It reminded city dwellers that some things warmth, food, community could be found in the bottom of a shared mug. This role is often overlooked. Historians rightly focus on infrastructure, guilds, and trade. But in daily life, beer was infrastructure. A street with no ale was like a street with no baker or blacksmith, unthinkable. But what happened as technology advanced? As water systems improved and tea, coffee, and imported drinks arrived, Could beer maintain its infrastructural role? In the final section of this story, we'll examine the decline of ale's necessity in the city and how it transitioned from a tool of survival to a drink of preference, a transformation as cultural as it was practical. As Europe stepped into the early modern era, cities began to change in fundamental ways. The streets became more orderly, the buildings sturdier, and most importantly, the infrastructure smarter. Aqueducts, cisterns, and regulated water supplies emerged, offering an alternative to what had, for centuries, been the default drink of city dwellers: beer. This final section of Story 4 traces the decline of ale's role as a daily urban necessity and its transformation into a cultural preference. No longer the cornerstone of hydration and survival, beer slowly took its place among other beverages, shaped less by fear of water and more by tradition, taste, and evolving identity. It is a story of displacement not abrupt but gradual, and of reinvention. A changing urban landscape. By the 16th and 17th centuries, particularly in wealthier cities across northern and western Europe, municipal water systems began to improve. Engineers developed gravity-fed conduits that brought spring water from outside the city walls into public fountains and wash areas. Wooden or lead pipes were installed in some neighborhoods, feeding into communal cisterns or directly into wealthier homes. In London, the New River Project, 1613, brought clean water from Hertfordshire into the city. In Paris, a growing network of aqueducts and public fountains allowed easier access to relatively clean water. By the late 1600s, even some tenements had shared taps. Though far from universal or uniformly safe, water was improving, and with that, beer's monopoly on hydration began to crack. The rise of new beverages. As trade expanded, new drinks entered the European market, and with them came new habits. Tea, imported from China via the Dutch and British East India Companies, gained popularity in the 17th century. Coffee, initially from the Ottoman Empire and later cultivated in European colonies, appeared in urban coffeehouses. Hot chocolate made from New World cacao became a fashionable drink among elites. These beverages had certain advantages. They were boiled in preparation, making them relatively safe. They were stimulating, not sedating, appealing to merchants and intellectuals. They were lightweight and portable in dried or powdered form. They were often seen as refined, associated with sobriety, trade, and modernity. For the first time in centuries, beer had serious competitors not just in function, but in cultural prestige. A question of sobriety. As Protestant reform movements gained strength in Northern Europe, a shift in attitudes toward alcohol began to take shape. Beer had always been tolerated, even encouraged, in Catholic and medieval culture, but Reformation ideals emphasized sobriety, discipline, and inner reflection. While outright prohibition was rare, heavy drinking was increasingly frowned upon, especially among the burgeoning middle class. Coffee houses became favored spaces for discussion, business, and scholarship, where caffeine replaced alcohol as the fuel of productivity. In England, they were called penny universities for the cheap cost of entry and wealth of ideas exchanged. Meanwhile, beer became associated with the laboring class. Still vital, still consumed widely, but no longer the drink of progress or refinement. This cultural reframing affected how cities allocated resources. Investments shifted from brewery protection to sanitation reform, public health, and piped water. The professionalization of brewing. Simultaneously, brewing itself continued to consolidate and professionalize. Urban breweries expanded into larger operations. Brewing science evolved, with more precise control over yeast, fermentation, and storage. Beer styles diversified: porters, stouts, lagers, pilsners. The public house replaced the alewife's bench. Licensed taverns, inns, and urban beer halls formalized the act of drinking. It became more social than survival-driven. Beer, once the invisible infrastructure of urban life, was now a deliberate indulgence. It was purchased with intent, consumed for pleasure, and regulated as a trade. Even small beer, once ubiquitous, faded. It was no longer needed for hydration. Instead, it was replaced by cleaner water and stronger brews meant to be savored, not sipped all day. Legacy in the urban fabric. Though beer no longer held its infrastructural role, its impact remained etched into the city itself. Street names, guild halls, and old canal routes still bore the traces of the brewer's influence. Brewer Street in London, Brouwersgracht in Amsterdam, Zamiki Pivovar, Castle Brewery, complexes in Czech towns. Former brewmasters' residences still standing in city centers. Old laws, such as beer purity ordinances or brewing taxes, continued to influence legal frameworks well into the modern period. The very concept of food safety regulation owes much to the medieval obsession with beer quality. Even urban labor customs such as the beer break or post-shift pint carry forward traditions of daily ale consumption. Beer's new identity. By the 18th and 19th centuries, beer in cities had shed its utilitarian identity. It was no longer the drink that kept children alive or prevented dysentery during plagues. It had become a cultural tradition, a marker of class or region, a commercial product, often national or imperial in scale. In Germany, lagers became state symbols. In Belgium, Trappist ales linked beer with spiritual identity. In Britain, beer became intertwined with pub culture, music halls, and working-class leisure. But its origins as hydration in crisis, nutrition in hardship, and infrastructure in disguise were largely forgotten. Today, few would think of beer as a public service, and yet, in the medieval city, that's exactly what it was. A closing reflection. What does it mean when a society's most basic drink is alcoholic? In medieval cities, it meant survival. It meant mothers giving children mugs of weak ale, not because it was fun, but because it was safe. It meant brewers working through plague, fire, and war, not for profit, but for necessity. It meant a civic trust that if the baker could bake, the brewer could brew, and life could continue. Beer was never just a drink. It was part of the hidden architecture of city life, boiled, fermented, and poured into wooden mugs passed from hand to hand. It sustained not only the body, but the rhythms of routine, the bonds of labor, and the fragile balance of urban survival. In forgetting this, we lose something not just about beer, but about what people needed to endure a world that offered so few guarantees. So the next time you lift a glass, consider this. Once, in cities filled with plague and fire, when the water could not be trusted, beer was the most reliable thing a person could hold. A pint of peace. A pint of proof. A pint that said, we're still here. Story 5. Water, water, undrinkable, the quality of medieval water supplies. To modern sensibilities, the idea that medieval Europeans drank beer all day might seem quaint or excessive. But this behavior wasn't the result of indulgence or ignorance. It was a direct response to a central, chronic problem: access to clean water. This section begins our exploration of one of the most quietly significant realities of medieval life: that water, one of the most basic human needs, was rarely safe. It shaped daily routines, settlement patterns, health, industry, and religious practice. And it directly influenced the widespread dependence on low-alcohol beverages as an everyday necessity. The water of the Middle Ages was not merely an environmental concern. It was a social fact shaping how people lived, worked, feared, and adapted. Let us begin not with a sip, but with a glance into the bucket and see what floated on the surface. What was water in the Middle Ages? To begin, It's important to understand that water, as a concept, meant different things in different contexts. There was rainwater, considered pure but unreliable and often poorly stored. Well water, common in villages and towns, but easily contaminated by proximity to latrines or livestock. Stream and river water, used for washing, watering animals and industrial tasks like tanning or dyeing, but frequently fouled. Spring water, the most desirable but not always available. Urban water systems, conduits and pipes, limited in reach and not always maintained. The quality of water varied by region, by season, and even by street. In rural areas, a deep, covered well might offer safe water. In cities, a shallow well might draw from groundwater saturated with human waste. Water was evaluated not with lab tests, but by sight, smell, and taste. If it looked cloudy, smelled foul, or tasted strange, it was avoided if possible. In practice, people did drink water, but they did so cautiously and often when no other option was available. The problems of contamination. The concept of germs or microbial pathogens did not exist in medieval medical theory. People instead subscribed to Galenic humoral theory, which connected disease to bodily imbalances influenced by external factors, including bad air, miasma, and spoiled substances. Still, they understood that dirty water made people sick, even if they didn't fully grasp why. Common sources of contamination included human waste, from chamber pots dumped into streets or cesspits. Animal waste, from livestock kept in courtyards or wandering freely. Industrial runoff, from tanneries, dyeing shops, and slaughterhouses. Decomposing matter, from garbage heaps, dead animals, and organic rot. Stagnation, especially in slow-moving or poorly maintained water sources. In cities like Paris, the Seine had become so polluted by the 14th century that records note people preferring wine or beer for all uses, even for cooking broth. In London, the Thames was both water source and sewer, with conflicting uses assigned to different stretches of river. Attempts to separate clean and dirty uses of water were often made by law or local custom, but rarely enforced effectively. Engineering a solution, urban water systems. Some medieval cities tried to address the problem through early engineering. In Rome, remnants of ancient aqueducts were restored and rerouted. In London, the Great Conduit System, constructed in the 13th century, brought spring water from outside the city into public cisterns. Similar systems existed in Paris, Siena, Bruges, and Barcelona. These systems were limited by capacity, unable to serve large populations. Distribution. Access was often restricted to the elite or certain neighborhoods. Maintenance. Leaks, breakages, and blockages were common. Sabotage or theft. People tapped into conduits illegally, diverting water or contaminating it. Moreover, even when these systems worked, people still had to collect water manually and store it in open containers, which could introduce new contaminants. In poorer areas, or in the absence of formal systems, people relied on water sellers, often boys or women who fetched water from cleaner sources and sold it by the bucket. This water was expensive and often unaffordable for the poor. Wells and the village commons. In rural areas and small villages, wells were more common and often the primary water source. Deep wells lined with stone and covered to prevent debris were the safest, but many were shallow, uncovered, or located near sources of contamination. Even a small village's spatial layout reflected concern for water quality. The well was typically placed uphill from livestock pens and latrines. Washing areas were placed downstream of drinking water sources. Tanners and dyers, if present, were required to operate at the village's edge. But this ideal was not always maintained. A family might keep pigs in the yard, wash clothes near the well, or empty nightsoil just a few feet away. During wet seasons, runoff spread waste into wells and streams. During dry seasons, stagnation bred disease. It is little wonder that many rural folk, like their urban counterparts, preferred ale when available. The cultural and religious meaning of water. Despite its risks, water held deep symbolic power. In religious life, water was the vehicle of baptism, blessing, and cleansing. Monasteries built elaborate lavatoriums, washing stations, and fountains, often using diverted spring water. Pilgrims visited holy wells, believed to possess curative properties. These waters were thought to be pure not just physically, but spiritually. The sanctity of water was deeply entwined with its source. Spring water, emerging mysteriously from the earth, was revered. Rainwater collected from monastery roofs was trusted. River water near a saint's shrine was deemed miraculous. Ironically, the symbolic and spiritual purity of water often clashed with its practical dangers. A holy well might be teeming with bacteria. A stream named for a saint might be downstream of a slaughterhouse. But belief, like thirst, often overrode caution. Medical beliefs and water use. Medieval physicians and writers frequently discussed whether one should drink water at all. The 13th century French physician Aldobrandino of Siena, in his popular medical treatise, warned against drinking water unless it had been boiled with herbs or taken from a running and clear spring. Water was considered cool and moist in the humoral system, potentially unbalancing to the body unless tempered. Alternatives were encouraged. Small beer for laborers and children. Diluted wine, pasca, for adults in warmer climates. Herbal infusions or spiced water when available. Even in monasteries, water was not consumed casually. Monastic rules often allowed ale, even during fasting periods, but required careful sourcing and blessing of any water used in rituals or food. Living around the risk. Ultimately, medieval people lived around the risk of water. They did not have the means to eliminate it. Their strategies included preferring boiled liquids, beer, soup, gruel, avoiding stagnant or foul-smelling sources, sourcing from known springs when possible, using wine or vinegar to purify water, at least in wealthier households. The choice to drink beer wasn't always about flavor. It was calculated survival, made from centuries of hard-earned experience. A mug of small beer was a daily act of risk management. But what happened when these systems failed, when even beer could not be brewed, and thirst could not be easily quenched? How did communities respond to acute water crises? And what do the historical records reveal about the tipping points of urban and rural hydration? We will look at specific historical events and case studies that reveal what happened when water or beer ran out. We examine how medieval people navigated the everyday challenges of accessing water, a resource never guaranteed to be clean, abundant, or even safe. But what happened when the already precarious balance broke entirely? When springs failed, wells were poisoned, or beer could no longer be brewed? This section explores specific moments in history when communities faced acute water crises, often triggered by war, disease, environmental shifts, or infrastructural failure. These events reveal not only the fragility of pre-modern urban and rural life, but also the resilience, improvisation, and desperation that emerged in response. The story of medieval water supply was not just one of slow adaptation, but of sudden and dangerous disruption. Case Study 1. London's Wells in the Black Death. In the summer of 1348, London, a city already struggling with water quality, saw its water situation deteriorate rapidly as the Black Death began to take hold. Contemporary chroniclers like Henry Knighton and Ralph of Shrewsbury described the city's atmosphere as one of mounting dread, not only due to the plague itself, but because trusted sources of water were failing. Public conduits became blocked or fouled. Well water stagnated as residents fled or died, leaving buckets and storage vessels to rot in the sun. Panic over contagion caused people to avoid communal taps, fearing that the water carried the death. As a result, brewing faltered. The Brewers Guild pleaded with the mayor for grain allotments and extra labor to maintain production of small beer, especially for the poor and infirm. In some parishes, small breweries operated with skeletal crews, their vats boiling under guarded roofs. The ale was rationed not by wealth or status, but by perceived need and vulnerability. One court record from the time references a widow who was punished for stealing a bucket of beer meant for the sick. It was theft, yes, but also a sign of how vital beer had become when water could not be trusted at all. Case Study 2, The Siege of Carcassonne, 1355. In southern France, the fortified city of Carcassonne endured repeated siege attempts during the Hundred Years' War. In 1355, the English under Edward the Black Prince attacked. Though the inner citadel was not taken, the surrounding suburb the Ville-Basse was burned, and the city was cut off from external supplies. Within weeks, wells within the city ran dry. The aqueduct, already in disrepair, was sabotaged by retreating forces. Local accounts describe residents drinking from ditches and attempting to boil linen cloth soaked in rainwater for sustenance. The city records show a sharp rise in deaths, not just from violence, but from dysentery, dehydration, and infection. One of the surviving scrolls records a city magistrate ordering the grain stores to be used exclusively for brewing weak ale, prioritizing it over bread. He reasoned that liquid sustenance was more urgent than solid food. The decision was controversial, but may have saved lives. Case Study 3, The Poison Well of Toulouse, 1209. During the Albigensian Crusade, the city of Toulouse faced an internal crisis. A local noble, sympathetic to the Cathars, was accused of deliberately poisoning a major public well, a rumor that spread like wildfire. No modern evidence supports the poisoning claim, but the response was immediate. The well was closed and sealed with an iron grate. Citizens were instructed to boil all water, even for washing. The bishop urged people to abstain from beer and wine in mourning, a request that only intensified anxiety. The local brewmasters, caught between civic panic and spiritual obedience, halted brewing for 3 weeks. It led to unrest among laborers who relied on small beer for hydration during work. In an ironic twist, more illness followed, not from poison but from people drinking water without boiling it after beer had been withdrawn. Toulouse's panic highlighted a unique and tragic interplay: religious virtue, public fear, and the underlying fragility of daily sustenance. Case Study 4, Drought in East Anglia, 1434. The summer of 1434 was marked by unusual heat and drought across parts of England, including Norfolk and Suffolk. In East Anglia, many villages reported wells running dry, crops withered, grain prices surged. More critically, beer production halted in many rural towns. The lack of fresh water made boiling mash impossible. Existing stock of beer was hoarded or sold at exorbitant prices. Some records show beer being sold at 3 times its usual rate. A fascinating letter survives from a yeoman named Thomas Wodehouse, writing to his brother in Norwich. "The mill hath no water and the brewer no firewood. Ale is scarce and bitter. We drink the cow's milk and pray for rain." Eventually, relief came with early autumn storms, but the event left a strong impression. Several towns commissioned new wells and began regulating access more closely, a primitive form of water planning. Case Study 5, Fire and Contamination in Lubeck, 1276. In 1276, a large fire swept through parts of Lubeck, a major Hanseatic city. Several breweries, latrines, and homes were destroyed. In the aftermath, ash and debris filled the open drainage canals. Rain swept charred timber and waste into public water sources. The city's famed Stadtwasser, a water channel fed by external springs, was briefly unusable. During cleanup, water became both scarce and dangerous. Records show that for 10 days, only beer was distributed in the city's communal kitchens. Even children were given weak ale, 4 ounces daily, one ledger states. The fire reminded the city's leaders that water was not simply a static feature of the city, but a living system that required constant vigilance. The ripple effects of water failure. In each of these events, plague, siege, drought, fire, we see water failure leading to social disorder, hoarding, theft, panic, rationing of both water and beer, survival decisions that prioritized drinkable liquids over other essentials, institutional learning, with some cities adopting better infrastructure or stricter cleanliness laws in the aftermath. Water crises were not aberrations, they were part of life, and the dependence on beer was not always a choice, but a calculation made under duress. Beer, with its mild alcohol and boiled origins, was the backup system, the liquid insurance policy, against the unpredictable nature of medieval water. Yet not all stories end with desperation. In the final section of this story, we will examine how some medieval communities successfully managed water, using innovative, if primitive, methods, and what lessons these examples offer in understanding the forgotten intelligence behind medieval survival. We explored the daily uncertainties surrounding medieval water supplies and the disasters that unfolded when systems failed. But to view the Middle Ages only through the lens of dysfunction would miss a deeper truth. Many communities found ways to adapt, mitigate risk, and even innovate. This is the story of how towns, monasteries, and even individuals designed systems of water use that, for their time, were surprisingly sophisticated. These practices were rarely standardized, and success varied, but they offer powerful examples of human ingenuity in the face of one of history's oldest problems: how to get a clean, steady drink of water. Let us look at the models that didn't collapse and the thinking that made them work. The monastic model, self-sustaining systems. Monasteries were among the best-managed communities in the medieval world, especially in terms of water. Why? They had centralized authority. Their populations were relatively stable. They valued ritual cleanliness, which required reliable water. They had the labor and land to construct infrastructure. The Cistercians, in particular, were known for their hydraulic ingenuity. Take the Abbey of Fountains Abbey in Yorkshire, England. Constructed in the 12th century, it had engineered channels bringing spring water into the cloister. It maintained separate water systems for washing, drinking, cooking, and industry. Wastewater was directed downhill and away, using stone conduits and grates. Rainwater from roofs was collected in cisterns, and sometimes filtered through sand and gravel. Monks even had scheduled hand-washing rituals, with clean water stored in large lavatoriums. In effect, these monasteries created early models of water zoning, dividing sources and uses to reduce contamination. Their example influenced the layout of later public infrastructure in cities, particularly in regions where monasteries were involved in civic governance. Cities that invested: Bruges and the controlled canal. Bruges, in modern-day Belgium, was one of the few medieval cities to maintain a long-term, semi-clean water supply. The city's network of canals was carefully regulated. Water from the Rii River was diverted through a series of controlled locks, sluices, and gates to regulate flow and prevent stagnation. Key features included zoning regulations that separated tanneries and dye works from domestic water channels, strict guild oversight, with penalties for illegal dumping or waste near water access points, seasonal dredging of canals to remove silt, waste, and organic debris. Use of water houses, towers where water was filtered and stored before public distribution. Travelers and chroniclers in the 14th and 15th centuries frequently noted how clean the city appeared, especially compared to other towns of similar size. Of course, Bruges wasn't immune to problems, especially in dry summers, but its success shows that deliberate planning, even with limited technology, could produce reliable results. Islamic influence in Spain, Córdoba and Granada. In Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain, water management took on an even more refined character. Drawing from Roman engineering, Arabic hydraulic knowledge, and Persian irrigation techniques, medieval Islamic cities like Córdoba, Seville, and Granada built systems centuries ahead of many Christian counterparts. In Córdoba, water wheels norias lifted river water into aqueducts. Underground channels, qanats, transported water without evaporation. Public fountains were common and often served multiple functions: ablution, drinking, cooling. Households had small cisterns that were refilled by rooftop catchments. In Granada's Alhambra, water flowed through gardens, courtyards, and baths not just for beauty, but for cooling, hygiene, and spiritual symbolism. Water was seen as a public good and divine gift. Its management was therefore subject to moral, religious, and civic responsibility. These systems influenced Christian rulers who took control after the Reconquista. Though some infrastructure fell into neglect, the ideas persisted, especially in southern Spain. Community-driven water rules. Even in small European towns, local ordinances show clear efforts to manage water intelligently. Examples include Norwich, England, 1290s. Laws required that all privies be at least 40 feet from wells. Florence, Italy, 13th century. Officials established a schedule for cleaning communal fountains and fined those who left laundry tubs or animals in them. Augsburg, Germany. Residents used a color-coded peg system to indicate when their cisterns needed filling from the municipal water carts. Avignon, France. Water carriers operated under licenses and were inspected monthly for cleanliness and accurate delivery volumes. These laws weren't always followed, but they reflected an emerging awareness of water as a shared resource that needed stewardship. Medieval rainwater harvesting. While rivers and wells dominated most conversations about water, rainwater harvesting was surprisingly common. Roofs were designed with tile angles and gutters to direct runoff into barrels or stone tanks. Monasteries and manor houses often had multi-tiered cistern systems, using sand or gravel for crude filtration. In areas with brackish or saline groundwater, like parts of Flanders or coastal England, rainwater was essential for drinking. This water was typically used for non-drinking tasks: washing, laundry, cooling, but in drier months, it was boiled and consumed when necessary. In some Mediterranean towns, rainwater was even taxed or regulated, with shared cisterns managed like communal grain silos. The result was a more resilient water economy, where households and communities had a buffer against drought and contamination. Forgotten wisdom. Many of these medieval innovations would later be discarded or neglected during the industrial period, when centralized water systems and modern plumbing took precedence. Ironically, some pre-modern practices now appear sustainable and adaptable in ways modern infrastructure often struggles to emulate. Local storage, low-tech filtration, and decentralized systems are making a comeback in climate-resilient design and off-grid living. The medieval world, often dismissed as unsanitary or ignorant, contains layers of local knowledge about water. How to balance scarcity and waste. How to share resources communally. How to filter, separate, and reuse. These weren't always perfect solutions, far from it, but they were born from necessity, not abundance, and that necessity produced insights worth reconsidering. A final reflection. When we think about the medieval relationship with water, it's tempting to focus on the grime, the murky wells, the river filth, the beer as water survival tactic. But beneath the silt lies something more enduring, a story of people who, without modern science or tools, learned to read their environment, adapt to constraints, and build systems however crude to endure. They boiled, stored, rationed, diverted, and hoped. They worked together, argued over waste laws, and petitioned for better conduits. They fetched buckets for the sick, fined tanners for runoff, and taught their children never to drink from the river after rain. In all of this was the quiet, practical intelligence of survival. And today, as climate shifts, infrastructure strains, and trust in water systems wavers in parts of the world, we may yet find value in what medieval people once knew by heart: that clean water is never a guarantee, only a goal, and that goal is never truly boring. It's life itself. Story 6. Baptized in barrels, children, ale, and daily nourishment. In a time before refrigeration, pasteurization, and germ theory, the line between nourishment and poison was thin. Food spoiled quickly, milk soured, and water could carry disease in every drop. And yet, life had to go on. Babies were born, children grew, and families did their best to nourish their young. So it may come as a surprise, or even a shock, to the modern listener that in medieval Europe, it was not uncommon for children, even the very young, to drink ale. But this was not the hearty, heady ale of tavern tales. It was small beer, weak in alcohol, warm from brewing, and safer than most water. This section explores how low-alcohol beverages became a central part of children's diets, how they were brewed for them, regulated, and even prescribed. From the nursery to the village school, from the harvest fields to the sickbed, ale accompanied childhood in the Middle Ages. It filled bellies, calmed fears, and sometimes kept death at bay. The context: why give ale to children? To understand this practice, we must strip away modern assumptions and consider the material conditions of medieval life. Clean water was uncertain at best and hazardous at worst. Boiled liquids like broth and ale were safer because pathogens were killed in the brewing process. Milk was limited. Cow's milk spoiled quickly and was rarely consumed by adults. Goats' milk was more common, but not always available or prioritized for humans. Nutrition was inconsistent. Growing children needed calories, hydration, and micronutrients in an environment where food supply fluctuated. Ale was a solution that met many of these needs. In its weakest forms, it had around 0.5% to 2% alcohol by volume, a supply of vitamins from the yeast, especially B vitamins, trace minerals and calories, warmth and hydration in cold months. It was, effectively, a nutritious porridge you could drink, and it could be made at home. Brewing for the nursery: the role of women. Most small beer in medieval households was brewed by women, particularly housewives and servants. Brewing was part of domestic labor, alongside baking, sewing, and tending to children. Mothers or nursemaids often brewed special batches of child's ale or weak ale, designed to be brewed from the third or fourth runnings of the mash, after stronger ale had been made. Contained minimal hops, which were bitter and sometimes thought too strong for young bodies. Boiled thoroughly and left to cool naturally, often consumed within a day or two. This ale was served in clay or wooden cups, porridge or gruel, mixed with oats or stale bread. Medicinal infusions, combined with herbs like chamomile or mint. In some cases, this early ale was also used for teething pains or to settle the stomach, a folk remedy echoed in many cultures. Use of small